You know, 100 years ago, it was thought that let's say archaic people, so those would be people who are still living a fairly isolated tribal life in small groups, basically operating at the level of Stone Age technology, let's say. The idea was, there was a very popular idea for a long time, that those cultures were communistic and violence-free, and that's wrong. They're not violence-free at all. If you track the homicide rates in Stone Age cultures, they're way, way higher than they are in civilized cultures, like orders of magnitude higher. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but I'm just telling you that because you want to dispense with the idea that along with complex civilizations and the spread, say, of unifying religious beliefs, there was an increase in baseline violence, because there's just no evidence for that at all. Now, the problem with these large-scale belief systems is they're not very fast. And part of the reason for that is that in order for a large-scale belief system to manifest itself in any reasonable form, it has to be predicated on the mutual agreement of the people who operate within its embrace. So for Toronto to exist as a city, as a peaceful city, basically what has to happen is that the vast majority of us have to agree that the rules that govern the city and the social interactions within the city are useful and just. And because if you don't agree with that, then splinter movements of all sorts start to occur, and people become more revolutionary in their modes of action, and then they become more violent, and the whole system starts to break down. So it's not easy to establish a collective norm, because people have to agree to it. And you can imagine that hammering out agreement with anything, with even a small agreement that affects many, many people, is a process that takes a tremendous amount of time. People can argue forever about the smallest alterations in the systems that regulate our behavior. Now, some of you might be familiar with the terror management theories. How many of you have heard of terror management theory? Okay, well, the terror management theories are predicated on the idea that our belief systems protect us from our fear of death. Now, exactly how they do that isn't specified particularly well in the terror management theories, but the originator of the theory, whose name was Ernest Becker, who was a sociologist, by the way, and a Freudian, believed that cultural systems enabled us to attribute beliefs to our actions, finite and infinite, so that we could consider ourselves in relationship to mortality and in some sense hide from the truth of the finitude of our existence. Now, one of the things the terror management theorists don't really give any credence to is the fact that belief systems are not only systems of belief, they're systems of action regulation, right? So we've talked about the Piagetian notion of a game. I mean, the game exists first as something that everyone can play, and only later as something that people represent. And a social culture is the same way. A culture regulates the way that you interact with each other and what you expect from each other and how you can fulfill your needs in relationship to one another. And then it's represented, and the representation might help you find meaning in your life, but the fact of the initial social contract, which is the phenomena that regulates your interpersonal behavior, doesn't protect you from the fear of death, it protects you from dying. And that's a very important thing to note. I mean, all of you know, of course, that it's very cold out today, and yet here you are in this classroom where it's, ridiculously comfortable, by classroom standards, and of course by standards around the world, and you're not freezing to death in here, and that's not your belief that's protecting you. It's the fact that you're embedded in this insanely complicated system of cultural interactions, and it just so happens that you get to sit here and listen to a lecture while there's thousands of people beetling around, many of them outside in the cold, making sure that the power grid, for example, that keeps this place warm is properly maintained and functional, which takes a tremendous amount of work. So during periods of rapid transformation, it's hard for the social contract to adjust itself so that everyone knows how to behave in relationship to one another, but then it's also very difficult for the description of that, so the articulated norms that constitute a society. it's very difficult of them to transform rapidly enough so that they can keep track of the changes and help people decide what they should do. So let me give you an example. So I had a client a while back who had been raised as a fundamentalist Christian, and she was very, she had been socialized and had come to believe that sex before marriage was wrong, but the probability that she was going to get married before she was 27 or 28 was low for a whole variety of reasons. And so then she faced this conundrum, and it was an interesting conundrum from my perspective, because, you know, I think that in a well-regulated psyche, sexuality is integrated into the personality so that it plays its role in the, what would you call it, in the polity of the self. It's integrated properly inside, and so it's under moral control, roughly speaking, because it serves its own function plus the function of keeping the person well situated in the present and developing properly in the future and maintaining proper relationships with everyone around them. But it was quite obvious to me that a lot of the constraints that had been placed on her behavior as a consequence of her relatively rigid belief were actually interfering with her development as a person. You know, and so one of the things we had to puzzle out was, well, exactly what are the moral guidelines that you should use to regulate your sexual behavior outside of marriage if you're not planning to be married for, you know, maybe until your late 20s? Well, you know, good luck trying to figure that out. Like, it's a really, really complicated question. And it's certainly not obvious that any one person can figure out the answer to that in a single lifetime, you know, even if they thought of nothing else, especially because the landscape itself is transforming as you're attempting to adjust to it. You know, and we eventually concluded, although it was a very individual solution, we eventually concluded that there were things that she had forbidden herself to do that were stopping her from establishing any kind of long-term relationship at all, and that was interfering with her development, you know, as a mature person, and that the morality that she had used to structure her behavior appeared to be counterproductive, at least, you know, in some areas. So it's one thing to, you know, to regulate sexuality in the hopes of marriage when you get married when you're, you know, 19 or 20 or 21. It's a completely different thing when it's perhaps not going to happen until you're in your late 20s. So now, Nietzsche talked a lot, and Dostoevsky talked a lot about the collapse of meaning systems in the late 19th century. And, you know, that was followed by a very, very rapid period of technological transformation. Like, that really kicked in the late 1800s, which was the, you know, was the height of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in England. And there were modern technologies being thrust out of the Industrial Revolution like mad, like the automobile and the airplane and the electric light and recording devices and all of the things that we're still elaborating on now. And then, of course, apart from the collapse of classic, say, Christian belief and the introduction of all these new technologies, when World War I hit, the entire monarchical structure of the Western world collapsed, and that also occurred, say, with regards to the Ottoman Empire, and that was partly what led to the creation of the modern Middle East, and of course that still hasn't been sorted out to any great degree at all. So the monarchical structures collapsed, these ancient civilizations. The Russians underwent their revolution and were, you know, and were transformed into communists. And then after World War I, the stress between the potential different ways of structuring societies after the monarchical societies had collapsed was almost unbearable, and people didn't really know what to do. Now, what happened at the end of Nietzsche's period and Dostoevsky's period was that the question that both of those people, the most important question both of those people asked became the central focus of the development of philosophical ideas of ethics in the 20th century. So you could think about those as that as a kind of a post-religious ethic. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because, among other things, is because a lot of what psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic treatment is about ethics. And that can't be stressed too much, because ethics is about how you see the world and how you behave. And so even behaviorists who are technically embedded in the scientific world are still practical ethicists, because what they're consistently doing with their clients is breaking down whatever the problems are that are causing them misery, breaking them down into sub-problems and trying to figure out solutions that improve their quality of life, like practical, implementable solutions that improve their quality of life, not only now, but as they propagate into the future. And that is not a scientific issue. It's a how to live issue. So the entire history of the 20th century, in some sense, political, economic, and psychological, was a sequence of attempts to answer the question, when your fundamental systems of ethics collapse, how is it that you should live? Now, Nietzsche said very clearly that there would be two consequences to the collapse of these systems, and one would be nihilism, the belief in nothing at all, which he also regarded as a form of escape from responsibility. So it's a logical consequence of the breakdown of classical belief systems, but it's also a cop-out, and it's the kind of cop-out that Dostoevsky explored very deeply in his small, brilliant novel Notes from Underground, which describes a person who's basically slipped, an intelligent person and an irresponsible person who's basically slipped into a pit of meaninglessness where he experiences hatred and resentment and the desire for revenge and all of the sorts of things that would afflict someone in the underworld who's got nothing to hold them together. And then, of course, Nietzsche also talked about the likelihood that people would turn to totalitarian belief systems, and he particularly discussed communism as a replacement for religious belief. I can give you a Canadian example of that. So I heard a Gallup pollster one time. I was at a conference in Ottawa. It's the only time I've ever heard this, and I think it's an amazing, it's amazing fact. They were looking at the probability that people would be separatist in Quebec. And if you were a lapsed Catholic, the probability that you would be a separatist was increased 10 times. And the reason for that is, you know, Catholicism fell apart in Quebec in the late 1950s. It was one of the last places in the Western world, roughly speaking, where the feudal, in some sense, structures of Catholicism had maintained themselves right up to that point, right up to the 1950s, late 1950s. And that collapsed precipitously, just like belief in Christianity had in Russia, you know, in the late, say, 1880s. And what happened in Quebec was, well, first of all, the birth rate plummeted. I mean, I did genetic research in Quebec, and in the 1950s and before that, it was very typical to see families of 9 to 13 children. And of course, but now, Quebec has the lowest birth rate, I believe, in the Western world. It's way below replacement. Everybody bailed out of the church. Nobody gets married. And if you were a separatist, if you were a lapsed Catholic, you were 10 times more likely to be a separatist. Well, all that meant was that when Catholicism fell apart, you know, people who still needed to have very structured belief systems just turned to nationalism as a natural alternative. You know, and that's part of what accounted for the rigidity and utopian utopian nature of the Quebec movement towards independence. You know, I remember talking to one of my colleagues, a very, very intelligent person, and you know, I asked him, because at that point they were predicting that if Quebec separated, the Canadian dollar would fall to 40 cents, 45 cents US, something like that. It'd be a complete economic catastrophe. I said, well, you know, the predictions are that if Canada separates, and first of all, or Quebec separates, and no one would know how to do that, is the Canadian economy will collapse, and of course that'll collapse the Quebec economy too. And he didn't deny that. He said, yeah, but it would be worth it. And I thought, well, there's just no way of having a conversation under those circumstances, because from my perspective, total, you know, severe economic collapse is a good reason not to do something. But if you believe that the future potential is such that that's justified, then, well, there's no arguing with you. It's just something that you've decided, and that's the end of that. And when I lived in Quebec, as I did for a long time, I learned very quickly never to have a discussion about politics with anyone who was a separatist, because it was just absolutely counterproductive. You know, they had axioms of belief that weren't movable, like the future will be good enough so that no matter what price we pay in the present, that will be justified. It's like, well, that's not an idea, right? It's a statement of faith. And you saw exactly the same thing happening, not with the same principles, I'm not saying that, but you saw the same thing happening from a psychological perspective in Russia when the communists, when the communists really started to become active in the 1920s, when any manner of horror whatsoever was fully justifiable because it was going to bring about some future state that was basically equivalent to paradise.